People have always dreamed of creating fully immersive media. Media that would be indistinguishable from our reality, that we would be able to touch and interact with in as natural as possible a way. TV and films such as Star Trek, The Matrix, and Minority Report depict this ideal of super immersive virtual realities in various ways. Bolter and Grusin argue that virtual reality should come as close as possible to our daily visual experience in order to create a sense of presence through immediacy and transparency. They roughly define immediacy and transparency in media as realism and ease of access. In their point of view, the future of digital technology is VR without controllers and GUI. Is this the future of UI? Bolter and Grusin envision an interfaceless interface, essentially returning to interacting with objects that we encounter in reality in exactly the same way as we interact with them in reality.
Ignorance is bliss.
Firewatch, for instance, does away with the GUI version of a map for the player and instead replaces it with a physical version of a map and compass. The player interacts with a map in the same way that we would in real life, which becomes a core mechanic of the game. However, this has a paradoxical effect. While the player's sense of immediacy and transparency is enhanced, it decreases the ease of interaction by taking away the technological affordance. Firewatch's design employs this purposefully. Its version of an interfaceless interface is one that necessarily burdens the player in order to create a sense of transparency. Bolter and Grusin's conception of a Minority Report-style future is misplaced. UI in video games is a creative tool to enhance user experience and overall affect within the player, not something to overcome. Dead Space is an example of a game that was roundly praised for its diegetic UI. The thing on your back is your health bar instead of pasting it in some corner of your screen, and every menu is seen in the actual game space as holograms. This could easily count as a primary example of transparent UI, since the character in the world interacts with the UI, not the player seeing it as a barrier to the game world. But why do we assume transparency, as in the hyper-real reality, is the only kind of transparency we are aiming towards? Bolter and Grusin use a quick recap of the history of Western art to propose that throughout the development of painting, photography, and film, we have been trying to capture reality. What Bolter and Grusin seem to desire is psychic communication, where knowledge can be transferred from one brain to another seamlessly. However, all messages are mediated. Obviously, psychic communication is not possible, so verbal communication develops in order for humans to communicate with one another. Every medium humans have created has been in service of getting thoughts from one person's mind into another. The means by which we do this mutate endlessly in pursuit of more seamless communication. We may think of photos and film as the closest representation of reality possible, but they both have specific syntactic features that remove them from reality while intensifying the appearance of reality in the viewer's mind. Some attempts at naturalism have been counterproductive. Long takes like those seen in Baby Driver, Birdman, Hunger, and Russian Ark should ostensibly create a sense of reality in the film. We do not have cuts in our lives, and when we observe action in the real world, it is uninterrupted. However, the effect of these long takes is again the opposite. It's a pointed choice that goes against typical film UI. Conversely, hyper-editing as a link to realism has led into scenarios where a simple conversation in Bohemian Rhapsody now has intrusive cuts. Yet this feels more like reality than the 20-minute long one-take conversation in Hunger. It is now more noticeable to not have cuts than to have heaps of them. The immediacy and transparency of film is enhanced by a carefully developed editing syntax. This is similar to how games that offer less affordances in the name of realism can feel dull, slow, and less immediate. Red Dead Redemption 2 employed a more realistic player movement speed. To counteract boredom between missions, the game world is stuffed with events and interactions that feel more unrealistic. Bolter and Grusin name photorealism and filmic realism as the standard that digital imagery is aiming for and that previous art forms strive towards. They suggest that as precursors to photography, painting techniques that erase the painter's brushstrokes and trompe l'oeil were developed to dissolve the boundary between canvas and reality. Painting was used as information communication in the pre-photography era, such as watercolours painted by early colonisers of New Zealand, or portraits used to facilitate royal marriages. Then, after the invention of photography, it was declared that painting is dead, when really painting has been liberated. By no longer having to bear the burden of documentary, painting is now free to explore its own material affect and is no longer enslaved by the reproduction of reality being a major criteria of its quality. Good paintings are no longer realistic paintings, but they may be even more immediate and transparent. Ideally, this is how video games will develop as well. Perhaps video games will only be free to explore their own materiality once another medium is developed, something that allows us to declare that video games are dead and put realism aside to pursue artistic goals as their main focus. In a similar way to painting and then photography, perhaps a different, more visceral technology will appear, and Bolter and Grusin's fantasy of the perfectly hyper-real reality will come into being and leave video games in the dust for the better. Because more realistic video games will not make video games better. Slave of God is an example of a game that cannot be described as having realistic graphics, and the only means of interacting with the game is through movement, which is altered by hypersensitive mouse movement. But the feeling of disorientation that the game seeks to create is efficiently and directly created. This, arguably, is more transparent than a hyper-realistic cowboy simulator. Bolter and Grusin's daydream of unmediated media will remain just that, a daydream. The idea that media or works of art attempting to capture reality can be objective views of reality is false. Our views of reality are mediated by the media we create. Video games are well on their way to achieving their own codified language, much in the same way as filmic realism has become accepted, while at the same time having the creative potential to break free of the limitations of realism.